Fighting words doctrine says that there are kinds of language, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise any constitutional problem. And one of these kinds of languages is fighting words, that is to say, words which by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. This is what is defined as fighting words in the Czaplinski decision. Now, what's interesting is that when people try to describe what is the capacity of language to inflict injury, how does an utterance do that, cause harm, cause pain? First of all, the decision says nothing about that. And when people describe it, they only describe it through metaphors with physical violence. So racial epithets are like a slap in the face, a punch in the gut. It always goes back to the metaphorical vocabulary, emotional scarring. These are the kinds of language that we have to describe the ability of language to inflict harm. And among linguistic scholars and legal scholars then, the debate really swirls around the status of these kind of malicious interpolations and of what their power is. And partly the problem here is that language is thought of almost always from the point of view of the speaker. So the question keeps coming up, do words, when they are intended to wound, actually have an inalienable power to do so? Or does the person addressed by fighting words, by words intended to wound, does the person addressed have the power simply to deflect them, to refuse to be wounded, right? How do you decide? The linguistic philosopher and poet Denise Riley observed that the power of words, she tries to resolve this issue by saying, the power of words to subjugate and to injure resides in the world and not in the particular addressee or addressors. At the same time, she argues, the ability of an utterance to harm an individual depends upon the degree to which that individual interprets acts of subjugation or injury as personal to them. That is, in her work, she concluded that grasping the impersonality of language diminished its ability to harm. But if you talk to trained practitioners of verbal abuse, people in the penal system, for example, trained practitioners of verbal abuse, they have no doubt about the effectiveness of verbal aggression, intimidation, vilification, and derision. These are all routine tools of subjection and control in institutional sites like the penal system. Threatening and demeaning interpolations are indispensable for example, in torture, for producing the state of objection that is sought in interrogees, and you can see this in interrogation manuals. Interrogators are taught to use these tools purposefully and strategically. Now, when trying to grasp the ability of language to wound and to destroy, to harm, Riley specifies and emphasizes the absolute importance of something that linguists have never figured out what to do with, which is the reality of what she calls inner speech, the reality of language that goes on in the head. Inner speech, she argues, is the carrier of linguistic injury. She says, and this is a quotation, "Injurious speech echoes relentlessly, years after the occasion of its utterance, in the mind of the one at whom it was aimed. The curse does work." And she reflects in her work very eloquently then on the effects of this, what she calls this sonorous and indwelling aspect of vindictive words. Repeated over time, those words can ingrow, she says, embedding themselves in the hearer until the message is no longer felt to come from the outside. So this is, for her, is the crucial way that words can wound. And she says, of course, it's also true that words of love and beauty can also indwell and have the same capacity to repeat themselves in the mind eternally. But, she says, love's work pales in comparison with hate's work, because hate injures, and injury requires healing. Language, on the other hand, language itself is indifferent to that distinction, right? Language operates, as she says, with a deep indifference as to where the side of the good may lie. So there's no function within linguistic systems that distinguishes between the word of love and the word of hate. And so the need for and the possibility of linguistic healing, then, is probably the clearest evidence of the reality of linguistic harm. And that's what I have to say. Thanks.
Last but not least, we have Avital Ronell, University Professor of the Humanities, Professor of German, English, and Comparative Literature, co-director of the Transdisciplinary Studies of Trauma and Violence at NYU, also Jacques Derrida Chair of Philosophy and Media at the European Graduate School, Switzerland. Avital Ronell is a leading philosopher and critic who has worked and taught an annual seminar in literature and philosophy at NYU with Jacques Derrida, whose work she's translated into English. She has also taught with Professor Hélène Cixous at the University of Paris-8. She is author of a number of groundbreaking books translated into many languages, amongst which Fighting Theory, 2010, The Uber Reader, Selected Works of Avital Ronell, 2006, The Test Drive on Nietzsche, Technology and the Experimental Disposition, 2005, Stupidity on Modalities of Cognitive Failure, 2001, Finitude Score, Essays for the End of the Millennium, 1994, Crack Wars, Literature, Addiction, Mania, 1992, etc. Avital Ronell.
Thank you. How is everyone? We're already in a very violent situation with your docile bodies strapped in, right? Do you need to make noise, or can we go on? Are you okay? As a true blue, very blue, obsessional neurotic, I have 15 trajectories, and all day I was thinking, should I go into narcissistic lockdown and tell you about my work? Or should I open up certain dossiers with you so we can have a conversation about violence? I want to thank you all for inviting our participation, which already indicates to what extent we're trying to engage extremely complex economies and economies also. We can't always account for, as my friends and colleagues have pointed out in various ways, for violence to be what it is. It needs to be inappropriable. Of course, certain violent framing devices occur and limited and make it perhaps graspable. But fortunately for me, violence is on the side of unintelligibility, which is my forte. And so I'm very close to the ground of violence, I think, when I try to be moved by it and talk to you about it, and I will do so in a nanosecond, which is what we're allotted. Let's just say that, I prepared some bullet points on violence today. I also, one of my trajectories, which I won't go over, was what I love about violence. Like, I was on the side of Malcolm X against the other one. You know, I was, well, never mind. There were many things that I wanted to discuss with you, including destructive jouissance, the violence in Sein Zeit, Heidegger's little book, where there's a question of the Stoß, which is the hit that you take, and even desire. In other words, and Levinas picks this up and goes with it in his Super Bowl, where he he points out, and then Derrida recircuits this according to other determinations, that the other wants to be violated. Now, I say that, of course, to provoke violence here and to bust certain economies, if I may. But what does it mean when the other requires, requests, and requites intrusive behaviors and syntax of approach? I don't want to leave that out of the field of our discussion, which is to say also in terms of security and so on, and surveillance and the violence of the state and the weaponry. Let's not totally crowd out where desire and libidinal economies insert themselves. In other words, what calls forth the kind of jouissance and joy. I'm sorry I'm saying jouissance. That's not up to date right now, but I'm just, fast tracking and doing shorthand right now. Jouissance of certain destructive modalities of being. In other words, just think, and this is a silly example, but it might set us on track. Think of those who dance in front of surveillance machines and want the intrusive kind of opening that certain scanning and surveillance technologies involve. This is going very fast, and I don't want to seem at all irresponsible because I could talk to you about it for hours, but I will spare you. I just want to also put up the list and column of nuclear desire. It's part of our rhetoric and the way we talk about quotidian fun, like it was a blast, this turns me on, this turns me off, and so on and so forth. So violence is what, this is shorthand and of course open to discussion, man does to man. This is what I think interests me also, modalities of aggression, of biting and being bitten and liking it. That's one point that maybe we want to include in our conversation. Now, the very fact that we're invited to talk recalls and evokes Levinas when he says that the saying stays its own violence and each time lays before you a peace offering. So the very, very possibility of saying, and that one is invited to say, may stave off violence, which doesn't mean that there's ever a violence-free zone that we can feel comfortable about, but there may be certain Scheherazade effects of singing for the other, dancing for the other, and saying as part of what Blanchot calls a sabbatical existence, meaning there might be one moment where violence is suspended, maybe even the violence of teaching and the transferential demands placed on teaching and so on and so forth. Moving right along, let's see. Oh, yeah. So I like to think about the way things travel at great velocities and and hug unintelligible edges. So I can't talk to you about what is calculable because I think once things become calculable and intelligible and part of a taxonomy that could be recognizable, we're no longer talking about violence. Violence may be that which eludes the very possibility for understanding, because when you're hit with violence, the problem is that you can't account for it, and yet there is infinite responsibility to it and to try to account, even if you can't account. And listen to the background music now. According to Arendt, we're still trying to recover from that day that Socrates was pummeled by the state and told to shut the fuck up. Okay, this is my translation of Arendt. That something happened also to thought when Socrates was murdered by the state, and we're still reeling from that event, which is to say that thought and certain kinds of speculative leaps, and this is often absorbed and repeated, internalized, and exscribed, so to speak, or made clear again by institutional stands and determinations. Certain types of risk-taking thought are shoved into a place of irrelevance. And this is what happens to every week. There was a little undertone and sense that, we're just academics or we're only. This is something to be considered as part of a history of violence, and the limits placed on the language that seeks to consider it, engage it, maybe question it in certain ways. Kant, the great philosopher, said that we philosophers, we thinkers, we psychoanalysts, okay, maybe he didn't say we Freudians, Kant, but he meant to, and he will have said that. We can only shoot blanks. The state doesn't give a shit about what we have to say, and we are impoverished in what we can do and say. But because we are so violently restricted in what can be done, it is our duty, indeed, and responsibility to shoot those blanks and really take risks and attack problems that I think my colleagues are working with in very exemplary ways. So at the same time, what does it mean to shoot blanks, and what does it mean to know that there's that even with all the hope that the Obama regime brought to us a year ago, there's not a place for something like an advisory board that would come from these regions of thought and risk-taking and even linguistic breakdown. There isn't an opening for that. So what does that mean to be living in that kind of restrictive space? Now, what interests me, or what I've been trying to do in some of my work, and then I'll cut it very short, I'm interested in, among other things, the displacements, the subterranean logic, the transmission systems, and historical bypasses, and the mourning disorders that prompt violence. In other words, the condemned sites of aggression. But I like to go to where cognition is disturbed and the access code is lost. So something that I'm studying right now and trying to work with is something that I'm calling anahistory, which is to say it's something like an ungroundable parallel partnering up with what we think we understand by history, and it requires a different kind of approach, maybe I'm not the only one to be working with anahistory or subterranean logic, that's for sure. But nonetheless, I'm compelled by the probing and piercing that it requires, and I'm trying to accumulate stuff around inoccurrence. Now, the violence of inoccurrence, in other words, I'm thinking of traumatic punch-outs and a different, maybe, register of anguish that accumulates around inoccurrence or the subterranean maneuvers of eventfulness. As Derrida has pointed out, for an event to be an event, we don't catch it necessarily in the outfield of thought. An event is that which, by its very violence, flies beneath our radars. We can't perceive an event. And this is a violence that he has certainly tried to work with, and I was thinking we could consider. So it's not only a matter of discerning disavowed horrors, and this is what I think everyone in a very poignant way has brought to bear a history or an anahistory of disavowed horrors. But it's not only that I'm thinking about, though anahistory hunkers down with such unearthable narratives, but also something that requires us to scour the national unconscious. The language usage, the failure to name, which we were talking about in different ways, but also all the while understanding that there could be something like a false unconscious. We don't even have the certitude or security of knowing that when you hit certain possible locuses of truth-telling, that too might be falsified or part of a false memory bank. And this is something that it's our responsibility to work with, the impossible. Otherwise, we can they don't need us to work on the possible. That's being worked on everywhere. But precisely where it gets messy, unintelligible, where we're trying to tap into a mess of jumbled surges and things that don't have a language that is discernible or readable. So I think we're working with all sorts of levels of intense unreadability. And this is something that is difficult to convey. I don't even know if those of you who haven't worked with me for 500 years know what the hell I'm talking about up here, saying that this is the let's say, the task that awaits us. But what has always been part of my, let's say, reading list and reading group, even if it's a reading group of one, though it hasn't been. I'm very lucky. I have friends and readers and true comrades. Larry Rickles is here, Shireen Patel, and others who are sitting here. And one is lucky not to be totally reading in the dark, but and wonderful, wonderful students at NYU, certainly. But one thing that we've been reading in one of the dossiers that I would have wanted to open tonight if I had been invited to speak for a decent amount of time would be something like the powerlessness of Dasein in Heidegger. And you're right not to have invited that. But I understand. The powerlessness of Dasein, in other words, the terrible responsibility and the assumption of powerlessness that even that redneck Heidegger managed to get across to us, the assumption of powerlessness. Now in a world where power and weaponry and subjectivization in terms of the imposition of power and its signifiers is so prevalent, what would the responsibility and the assumption of powerlessness involve and indicate? So let us consider this moment of sabbatical existence that as a practice of peace and as a moment in which the exposure of violence and to violence will have deferred itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the panelists if they would like to take a couple of minutes to respond to each other before we open the floor up for questions from the audience.
We can open.
Open to the floor.
Okay, bye.
1 second. One announcement here. Martin Daughtry, yeah.
Oh, are they going to go?
No, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Martin Daughtry. I, along with Elena and Crystal and Arvind, am one of the Humanities Initiative fellows, and on behalf of all of us, just wanted to thank you once again for coming and speaking with us. For the audience, I wanted to provide a little more context to this deeply strange event. We have been having these weekly lunches, and we have been talking about our own research projects over the course of the year, and have been searching often desperately for through lines that connect our very, very disparate projects. And violence kind of came up very early as one of the more profound of those that connects the projects of the four of us. So we put our heads together and thought, who would we like to speak to? We were speaking to one another. We're benefiting from talking with one another. If we could expand this conversation to include, the 5 smartest people that we know or know of who are working on related issues, who would those 5 be? And you're looking at the 5, and you've now heard the 5. We wanted also to pick people who were spread out disciplinarily in order to kind of maybe answer, by organizing this event, one of the questions that we had, which was, does the nature of violence necessarily require an interdisciplinary approach? More specifically, what do ethnographers and political theorists have to say to scholars of intextualized or symbolic violence, and vice versa? So now you've heard from people who represent very, very, I would say, not points, but kind of smears along that spectrum. So very quickly, I just wanted to, I think, read a few of our questions that we submitted to you. We gave you questions, a list of them, far too long to do justice to today. And we asked you if you would rather supply your own questions, and some of you have taken us up on that. So very quickly, do you understand violence as always involving a productive dimension? In the situations you examine, what results does violence produce? Or is violence ever simply caustic, dissolving both structure and agency on the sides of perpetrators and victims? How do we conceive of the ethics of nonviolence? Do nonviolent movements always involve a moment of violence, for example, to the self? A question that Banu has taken up very eloquently. How is the relationship between catastrophic and everyday forms of violence? What is the relationship between catastrophic and everyday forms of violence? And then lastly, I'll end with, how have you conceived of and worked through the ethical obligations that your work in violence assigns? For example, what different forms of obligation do methods such as ethnography or literary study or philosophy evoke? How does one work on violence without becoming a voyeur or accomplice to it? Which is, a difficult question that hangs over us as we organize an event such as this. So thank you for helping us kind of think around, if not through, this unthinkable thing, and help us grapple with this troubling and troubled concept. That's my contextual speech.
Now we have some questions here. There's somebody back there, and then there's Peter in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. This is a question in 2 parts. The first part is addressed at Anitel Rondell. Forgive me the pronunciation there.
No, I won't forgive you. Now that is a violence. I mean,
well, exactly.
Ronell.
We're getting there. We're gonna.
Okay, Avital Ronell.
Thank you so much. My apologies. And the second. Oh, we're there again. I know. And the second half is directed at Banu Bargu. First of all, I'd like to ask, isn't there something, we talk about violence as unintelligible, but isn't there a sense in which violence is the first thing that is intelligible? That is, and even the flip side of that, isn't intelligibility itself violent? That is that perhaps if I just bonk somebody on the head, isn't that immediately establishing something like a power structure, which might be prior to language, but certainly is intelligible and very directly so? Isn't there a sense in which to judge or to categorize? You had mentioned taxonomies. Isn't there a sense in which taxonomies themselves are violent in that they preclude another possibility or a different narrative? The second half of my question, or as we've seen in the internet, without the threat of violence, there's really no hope of social order or politeness as far as that goes. We're all behind screens. The second half of my question is you had talked. You had spoken about how it's very easy to see how violence is engendered from narratives of violence are engendered from direct physical violence to another. But how is that related to how the nonviolence of self-directed violence? Is that experienced as similarly traumatic when we witness the violence to another, we have perhaps a spontaneous moral impulse, right, to feel for the victim. But when we see somebody self-inflicting violence, is that the same sort of impulse, or how does that affect? And is that similarly traumatic, or is it something a little different? Thank you very much.
Do we want to take a few questions? Yeah, there's Peter in the back. Did you get the mic to him? Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to ask a question which is open to all of you. It's quite a reductive and purposely provocative question. Just over the summer, I was doing research in the Middle East, and while I was there, I was hanging out, you could say, with a former associate of mine who now works for the Pentagon. And he was exerting a great deal of effort to try to recruit me for the second time to work for the Pentagon. Anyway, in discussing some of these issues, again, in a very reductive manner, he replied, "We at the Pentagon don't read this touchy-feely shit." So my question for you is, as academics, is it enough to just shoot blanks, or is there something along the lines of, say, Foucault's working in prison reform that would be necessary or incumbent upon us?